Coming up, Legends Night for Big Blue brought stories from Kayvon Thibodeau meeting one of his legendary idols in LT, plus Eli Manning reflecting on the helmet catch. But ultimately, it's new defensive coordinator Shane Bowen that sheds light on what to expect on the defensive side of the ball and names that were and were not mentioned. We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, and we're talking about not only Giants Legend Night and some great takeaways and some fun stories, but also getting a little taste of this Hard Knocks and what we're learning about that defensive side of the ball, Andy, and what could be a very changing of the directions at certain key positions.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Today we're going to focus a little bit on, all the good feelings for anyone that's followed the Giants for years. You have some of the Super Bowl winners from the past. And then, I think the majority of this will be about Hard Knocks and how Joe Shane and Brian Daboll felt about it. And showing the clip of Shane Bowen, I thought was fascinating. But Adam, you see the red carpet that they rolled out. You see Phil Simms and Lawrence Taylor together. You see some of the older Giants. You see Eli Manning, Tiki Barber, Amani Toomer. I mean, the names are endless. Seeing Bill Parcells and Tom Coughlin also there, to me, was like a super exciting thing to see. And just having all of those Giants greats in the room, it felt like there were some really good vibes. Neither of us could obviously attend, but we followed through a lot of the different social channels, people posting some really great clips. Was there anyone that you were excited to see or to hear that was there or was chopping it up with the team?
Listen, I think a lot of the old school players are fun. Amani Toomer is a guy that I think everybody has an affinity for, but I also think is not a wide receiver that you put up in your mind as like a pantheon of all-time greats in the NFL at large, and then even for the Giants. But then you remind yourself of his stats, and you remind yourself that he was there through some of the struggles and there through the Kerry Collins and into the Eli Manning, and then got to be a part of that. So it's fun. It's fun to see those players come back around, and then I think the bridge between, as we're the first one to talk about here, is the Kayvon Thibodeau. This goes back to draft and how he talked about himself and, post-playing career and all those things. But he very quickly over the first couple of seasons, I think, has become affable. He's always been personable. He's funny, and he knows how to engage with a crowd. So I like the exchange that he had, obviously, and telling that little like background story with LT, because of course, LT could be 98 years old and he'd still be letting young guys know how I could go out there and get half a dozen sacks right now.
Yeah, you mentioned Amani Toomer. I just wanted to say, people forget Amani Toomer almost leads the Giants all time in both receptions and yards. What I think is fascinating is
available.
What I think is could he be a wide receiver 4 right now? Maybe. What I think is fascinating about him, Adam, is like he had over 9,000 yards receiving for the Giants. The next up, I believe, has like 5,700. He is like so far ahead in the pantheon of Giants wide receivers and his accolades that people just seem to forget him. Obviously, Odell Beckham, was a star that shined very brightly for a short period of time. Amani Toomer had the longest career, longer production. You mentioned Kayvon Thibodeau. Yeah, the stories were great. Obviously, you hear him talking with LT, and LT asked him how many sacks he had last season. And Kayvon Thibodeau said 11 and a half, and LT said, what did you only play in 3 games? Was that what's happening here? And it's just like, an all-time great, ribbing a guy that he really does think, has the potential to be a star in Kayvon Thibodeau. It's just good to hear some of the older guys and the newer guys getting together. It's good feelings considering the product on the field hasn't been all that great over the last couple of years.
Right. Yeah. You're bringing some, hey, like these are some vibes of some very successful players for the Giants organization. Feel free, pick their brain. Let some of that rub off on you. And I think the Kayvon Thibodeau piece, just talking about all the guys, Strahan and OC, right? And he goes down that list of the greats that have played along those fronts for the Giants. And that's that pedigree that you want to stay with. The other one, see, there's the thing about Eli Manning. He's become like the Giants mascot now between his show and everything else, and he's back around the organization, and we know that and we love it. But you still get fun stories out of him, but that feels different because he feels more like your uncle that always comes to every single party and always tells you, oh, remember that great time? Let me give you that story one more time. And it was still fun to hear about him, Tyree, and of course the helmet catch.
Yeah, that was to me the best clip of the night. Eli Manning, just the deadpan humor that he has is why he's so successful in his second career after football. Yeah. But he basically looked and he's like, Yeah, so Chris Snee, nobody blocked anyone. It went totally according to plan. Like Chris Snee turned around, was like waving his hands like he was open, like I was ever going to throw him the ball, which I think is hilarious. And like he's like, it's just how Tom Coughlin drew it up. Nobody block anyone, and Eli use all of your athleticism to break away from pass rushers. And
Yeah,
just throw
you're
over the
natural.
middle into quadruple coverage and make sure to hit David Tyree in the helmet. Like
Yeah.
just exactly how he drew it up. And like to me, that gets all the good vibes back. Obviously, Eli is one of those funny guys, and really, to me, that and the Mario Manningham catch are two of the greatest catches in NFL Super Bowl history. Never mind
Yeah,
just for
yeah.
the Giants. And it is just great to think about, those memories and those teams. Obviously,
It's also funny just to remember that the end of Eli's career with the Giants was not great. Right? You know what I mean? Oh, yeah, go ahead. You want to give someone another shot? We'll go ahead and take away his Iron Man streak. We'll let Geno Smith get some reps. It's, all these things that happen at the back end. Like, there were some bitter pills there, even the last couple of seasons when it was okay. We're going to let go of Tom Coughlin, and how hard that was for Eli Manning. And he was the coach that he grew up with in the NFL. So all of those things, I think, then do feel nice and quelled and smoothed over, and then it's just a really good fun night. One last note I will make before we flip it over to what I think is the most interesting thing that we got out of this in the Hard Knocks preview. As you mentioned there, it is Amani Toomer with 94.97 in total yardage. Then Odell Beckham Jr. at 54.76. Frank Gifford, let's just go deep cuts. He's the third highest ranking in receiving yards. And then it's a running back, of course, in Tiki Barber with 51.83. Like the legacy in the wide receiver room is pretty thin historically for the New York Football Giants. And it does make it interesting to start to get excited about Malik Neighbors and like, hey, could this be the first year? You only have to have like a 5 to 7 year strong start to your career to all of a sudden be one of the top 5 wide receivers of all time in yardage for New York
yeah,
Giants.
it is interesting when you think about some of the legendary like plays. It was made by Mario Manningham, who
Right.
wasn't here very
Right.
long. It's never going to be in the pantheon of the history books. The helmet catch was made by David Tyree. Shout out Syracuse alumni. He only had a short stint with the Giants as well, but made his huge impact. When you think about Odell Beckham being second on the list, but he was only here for a handful of years. Like when you think about Plaxico Burress making the Super Bowl catch, he came over from a different team, made a huge impact, but only in a short amount of time. So, Adam, that is an interesting point that you make, where like the long-term longevity career of the wide receivers for the New York Giants is not like it is for, say, I don't know, the Pittsburgh Steelers, where you have
Right.
decades of success with even guys like Antonio Brown, Hines Ward. You go on and on all the way back into the 70s. The Giants don't feel like they necessarily have that, but maybe Malik Neighbors is the type of guy that can vault himself up into the top 5 all-time receiving yards for the Giants.
20th overall in Giants history for Plexico Burress in a very short stint with them. And I always love that rounding out the top 10, Takeem Nicks and Ike Hilliard, which that's Amani Toomer, right? And that's that era. You go in even with bridging over from Tiki Barber into that next era. Just behind them outside the top 10 is Victor Cruz. So it's like, there you go. That's all the guys. Those are all the names that jump out to me when you think about the New York Football Giants. Coming back here in a minute, though. We got a little preview of Hard Knocks. We got some insights about how much access we'll get from Hard Knocks. How did Joe Shane and Brian Dable feel and acclimate to it? And what do we think about Shane Bowen and his perspective on the defensive side of the ball? This was the fascinating part coming out of Giants Legends Night, and we'll get into all that coming up here in just one moment. All right, so as we continue today's One Giant podcast, we let you know our episode is brought to you by Pietential, Pietential. That spells Pietential. It is a free online assessment tool for individual users, sets a baseline for your well-being, gives you tools to improve over time, and tracks your progress. No matter if you're starting out your rookie campaign as a wide receiver in the NFL or in year number 5 doing a podcast about the New York Football Giants, you always want to make sure that you're getting into your days the right way. So check out Pietential today. The other thing we'll check out, Andy, is Hard Knocks. So first thing, just real quick off the top here, we're going to get into how did Joe Shane and Brian Dable acclimate to the process of having them in the room. But there was one little note here about how the New York Football Giants hold ownership over final cut rights when it comes to what will go out. We're going to talk about Shane Bowen, so it already feels like the insights are going to be fun still. Like, I don't feel like we're going to get cheated here, but any risk of, or any potential of finding out what happened with the Jonathan Brooks situation. Did the Giants really get snake bitten there? If they did, and there was some cursing in the war room, guess what? That's going to end up on the cutting room floor. We're not going to see that when it comes to Hard Knocks.
Well, there's one distinction. So NFL Films reserved the Giants' final cut on only things that would be a competitive disadvantage to the Giants. So if someone acted a little bit inappropriately or made a fool of themselves or did
Yes.
something
Yeah.
wrong, you will see those
Yeah.
things. That's why I'm still holding out hope that we will see what happened with Wink Martindale at some point. Like
Oh,
that
no, no,
would
no.
be
The Giants were like, you put all that in that. We're going to give you almost too
yeah,
much
like
footage
you
around
can
that.
do all that. Just don't talk about who we were thinking about drafting. Like we don't
Yes.
want that
Yeah, exactly.
out there.
Exactly.
But yeah, I found that fascinating. I think you're still going to see good, a bunch of positive things. But yeah, just making sure that the Giants don't have a competitive disadvantage where it's like, man, we really need another wide receiver in the room or something. Like obviously they don't want that out there because then teams can have leverage over the Giants. But to your point, Adam, it was interesting because obviously Hard Knocks will come out July 2nd. You'll start seeing a lot of the footage from when the season ended all the way up until now. And Bob Papa did a great job being the MC at the Legends night. He asked Joe Shane and Brian Dable about their experience on Hard Knocks. How easy was it to get acclimated? Adam, how easy would it be for you to have a camera crew follow you around basically for like 3 months straight?
Oh, buddy, I think no one's aware of this, but there's a docu-series coming out at the end of this upcoming season. It's just a day in the life. It's 3 months in the life of a podcaster and just, going through all of it. No, I think it'd be mostly fine. And then you would have a harsh reality of like, oh, I just need like those pockets when whatever it might be. I just need to not have to be worried about this light shining in my face and everything being tracked. I'd like to think it'd be mostly fine, but that could be grossly overselling the fact that I'm like totally with it all the time and have my ducks in a row.
Yeah, you're totally omitting the fact that you live in the Truman Show right now. You don't know this whole thing is scripted
Yeah,
around you, which
that
would
as
be
well. Yeah,
fascinating.
it's all
But
happening right now.
so they asked Joe Shane that exact question. They asked Brian Dable, but Joe Shane first said, it was strange, and he said that he's still to this day not acclimated to it because, as you can tell, Joe Shane is not a guy that goes out in the media and makes bombastic comments. He's a guy that is on the straight and narrow, doesn't really give the media much when he talks. He's very genuine and thoughtful when he speaks. So he said
Right.
that the crew was in his office. He said it was kind of challenging just having them there all the time. He's still, like I said, he's still not okay with it. I thought Brian Dable's answer was way funnier and way more like totally Brian Dable. What he said was basically, it was easy for him because he would take his phone into Joe Shane's office with the cameras rolling and he would turn on whatever music was on his playlist so that the cameras that were recording couldn't actually use that footage because there would be copyright infringement from the songs that were being played. He's like, so it was easy for me. I just turned on the music and then told Joe whatever I wanted to, which I
Right.
thought was kind of hilarious. And it's pretty on brand that Joe Shane's like, I'm a little uncomfortable in the spotlight. And Brian Dable's like, I figured a workaround for this. Like, let me just put on whatever hits from the 80s I've got playing.
Yeah, no, and listen, and you kind of want that to be the dynamic. You want your head coach to be a little bit looser, not really worried about it. Hey, I can sort this out when I need to, and like that comes down to how to communicate with players and during the game, during practices, during film sessions. It's all about navigating, with cameras or not. It's about navigating those things. Whereas Joe Shane is like, hey man, I'm trying to make moves. I'm trying to have calls. I'm trying to crunch numbers. Like I don't need this thing hanging over my shoulder where I have to worry about the way that I phrase or verbalize something all the time. So that part of it was definitely interesting. And you wouldn't expect, I think, anything less than a little bit of discomfort around it. Now, when it came to getting a little bit of a peek behind the curtain of Hard Knocks, I thought it was great that they started with giving you a look at Shane Bowen, who is the new DC. We understand out from under, whatever. We moved on from Wink Martindale's the bottom line, and there's going to be some reshaping here. And I thought it was fascinating the way that he talked about what he needed, what he wants this team to be driven by, and where he identifies having some success, what some player roles are going to be. And then I think you found it particularly interesting, maybe players that weren't mentioned when we were being asked about roles and who fits where inside of this defensive scheme.
Yeah, it was very easy, and he breaks it down very simply, so that like even if you're not an X's and O's guy, you're not breaking down the all 22s like Adam is every single night before he goes to
Yeah.
sleep. You kind of hear him talk about what kind of system he wants to run. He's like, it's a 3-4. You have three guys with their fingers down in the ground on the line, and we have four guys. We have two pass rushers, one on each side, and two linebackers in the middle. And what he said was the most important people in my system are actually the middle linebackers, and so That's a
Yeah.
good thing, knowing how good Bobby Okereke was last season. He will obviously be the heart and soul, the leader on the inside. He's going to be the brains of the operation for Shane Bowen. I thought that was pretty telling that, those two players are going to, whoever's going to be starting alongside Bobby Okereke is going to be equally as important in Shane Bowen's system. Probably still to be determined on how that's all going to look. But then obviously, to your point, he started talking a little bit about the edge rushing room. And I think that's where you and I both listened to the clip and went, huh, like that's interesting. I wonder why he said what he had said. So take it away, Adam. What did you take away from Shane Bowen's comments there?
Yeah, just on the inside linebacker spot too. To your point, hey, they're going to be critical. We need our smartest players to be on the inside linebacker spots. We obviously love Bobby Okereke. He's already regarded as one of those high-level, intelligent, great, smart players there. Now it's about who's playing alongside of him, right? We know McFadden's been in the mix there. Is he ready to take that next step? Is there going to be some rotation involved there? But that becomes a really fun, not in a negative way. I think it becomes a really fun watch for how that develops over the course of training camp. Then we get to the edge rusher room. And it's obviously we know the key players, and it's not like he sat there and said, "Hey, we're talking about Kayvon Thibodeau, he's so great," or Brian Burns, he's amazing. But it was about we want to get pressure, and they actually flashed the clip of the Titans' defensive front getting after Patrick Mahomes for the Kansas City Chiefs, and you're like, "Oh, okay, this is what you want to build here." But when he talked about who are those guys going to be, it was, well, could it be Basham, who has familiarity with? Could it be Ryder Anderson, who ends up stepping up in that role? And that just it has to peak up your ears because you didn't hear, and this could just be very clip selective, but you didn't hear Azeez Ojulari. And based on signing Brian Burns in the offseason, you would probably think that that would be the first guy you'd mention because we assume his hierarchy is going to shift here a little bit. He's going to slot in behind the massive key free agent acquisition. And you would think that that'd be the first guy you'd point to and say, and Azeez Ojulari is going to be critical because he now gets to benefit from having this new, better, high-end talent in front of him.
Yeah, keep in mind that we don't actually know what the date was from this clip. It
Also true.
obviously was a few months ago. We don't know what the roster looked like. We don't even know if the Brian Burns trade was completed
Maybe.
when he had
That's
talked
true.
about this, right? So that's a little bit of a tough part where you're getting the snippet and you're like, huh, that's interesting. But to your point, Shane Bowen runs this 3-4. He does not like to blitz. We talked about it before. Wink Martindale blitzes like 85% of the time. He wants to get pressure from every single direction, wants to confuse people. Shane Bowen doesn't. He needs those edge rushers to get pressure without bringing more men. And that's why it's so important for the linebackers to be able to stay where they are and be very thoughtful about it because they're not sending extra pressure. There's going to be longer delays when the quarterback's trying to get the ball out. So it's even more important for guys like Thibodeau and Burns to
Yep.
get pressure. But to your point, it is interesting. We talked about, cut potential players on the team. We had mentioned Boogie Basham considering he has no guaranteed money on his contract. We didn't even mention Ryder Anderson because I think you and I both agreed that we think he's kind of a fringe. Will he or will he not even make the roster to begin with? But the fact that we didn't hear throughout that Azeez Ojulari being like, I can get the untapped potential out of him. We mentioned him as a surprising cut casualty,
Yeah.
maybe as training camp and they get to the 53. If this is the full clip and he's not mentioning Azeez Ojulari, there's a problem there. Like I think that they're looking at it and saying he's been too injured. He has not produced the way that we want, and we got to find something somewhere else.
And I think too, when you hear him say it, he says, "Can Basham be that guy?" Right? He doesn't say, Basham is that guy." Same thing with Ryder Anderson. Now, to your point, you can take it one of two ways. Are we talking about like the back end of things and how this roster is going to fill itself out? Maybe, but I think there's validity in what you're saying. And while when we talked about Azeez Ojulari as a cut candidate, I know you put him up there. And by the way, we were saying surprise cut candidates, not hey, this will be a no brainer. I push back on it a little bit just from, maybe try to ride into the season. You see if there's some value there. Maybe you trade him, or you're just willing to play out the string and say, hey, it is what it is. Either this guy becomes a contributor for us this year, or he walks into free agency. He's a draft pick from a previous regime. Joe Shane is not going to associate the quote unquote failure around Azeez Ojulari the way he might around Evan Neal, right? A guy that his name is attached to and a player that they are going to stick around with and keep trying to find a way to have him be successful. So I find it fascinating, and I'll even go the step further in terms of interesting things to watch for here. So you mentioned Ryder Anderson, and then if you think about that mold of player, I want to get to Isaiah Simmons here, but even on a deeper level, Darian Beavers, a guy who came back from injury last year, did not look fully healthy and clearly was not. If he gets back to the version of the prospect that I thought he was coming in, He fits the, well, we don't need to blitz all the time. Sometimes we just need good pressure. Sometimes we need some athleticism and the ability to drop out and spread into coverages. He's a guy that I'd keep my eye on, but also a mentioned name asked by the Giants to Shane Bowen as he's giving a speech was, how do you envision Isaiah Simmons? And that, I think, is the athletic versatility that a coach like Bowen is going to value inside of his system.
Well, and the last thing to tie off, and the athleticism is important, and I think that's noteworthy. The reason why I find it fascinating on the Boogie Basham versus Azeez Ojulari thing is if you go back to their relative athletic scores as they were going through the draft and going through their process, Azeez Ojulari had an 8.18 out of 10, which is pretty good, fairly great. Boogie Basham was a 9.38 coming out of Wake Forest. So, like,
Yeah.
when you talk about the athleticism, they look at Boogie Basham saying, I know you're 2 years older than Azeez Ojulari, but you have more
So as a
upside in the
molded player.
athleticism of Shane Bowen's system,
Yeah.
which I think informs, to your point, why they were asking about Isaiah Simmons, what they were saying, and Shane Bowen saying, like, he's a guy that we have to find a way to unlock the potential. And I think everyone has felt that way since seeing him at Clemson. Like, he's a Swiss Army knife. He's really good at a lot of things, but is he great at one thing? We don't really know that yet. And that's going to be Shane Bowen's, like, little Rubik's Cube to be able to solve in all of this, because if he can unlock whatever role it is, and it was interesting the role that he had stated for Isaiah
Yes.
Simmons, if he can unlock that potential, you're talking about the sky being the limit for him being able to get reps on the field.
Yeah, he mentioned first and second down playing in the nickel packages, and then later on the downs shifting into the back, right? Getting into the back end of this defense. And to your point, we know sometimes I think the eye test on guys and Simmons or otherwise, when players have speed and athleticism, you go, it must be great. Like they're going to be great, but tackling matters, field awareness matters, right? Where your coverage is supposed to be, being able to pick up and change your assignments and communicate with other defensive players. So sometimes that plays a big role here. And I think if we wanted narratives to watch, I'd be saying, well, Isaiah Simmons, if we can track this forward into training camp and think about him not as a 70% of the snaps player, but in 35 to 40% of snaps, being utilized in a somewhat specific and effective way. Remember, you're talking about in nickel packages, looking inside that secondary and saying, we know we have a lot of questions here. We have Darnay Holmes and Cordell Flott and brought in Herndon. Like, it extends to the cornerback discussion if we're thinking about zone schemes and covering in space and then still having enough size, strength, and speed to help close down and support against the run as well. So yeah, this is what you dream on. And a lot of teams, and the Giants dreamed on this when they traded for him initially, and they're still dreaming on it when they chose to bring him back.
Isaiah Simmons was pick number 8 of the Arizona Cardinals. We talk about this athleticism. It's not at a coincidence that we talk about how important athleticism is in Shane Bowen's system. It's not convoluted blitzing schemes where people can get home. It's you need to beat a guy one-on-one with your athleticism in order for his defense to work. Adam, we mentioned Boogie Basham being like a 9.3. Coming out of Clemson when he was picked 8th overall by the Arizona Cardinals, Isaiah Simmons had a 9.97. Like 9.97 is almost the perfect freak
You're right
athlete.
there.
It literally,
Yeah.
like out of 2,082 linebackers that have ever been tested for the relative athletic score, he ranks 7th. Like
Yep.
that's how athletic he is, and that's why all of us as Giant fans, and clearly the New York Giants, cannot quit Isaiah Simmons. There has to be a bigger role for him to play, knowing that you can put him everywhere. It's just a matter of which role will he flourish in, and it seems strange to think that like he hasn't gotten that figured out yet.
Well, and again, because we'll close on this last note here in a second, but again, athleticism is not everything, right? It's a great baseline, but you need to be able to put those pieces together. When he first came out, what role did he want to play? What position did he want to play? And he had ideas for himself of where he'd be best suited. You get mismanaged by defensive coordinators. They can't find the right way to develop you. So it's an everybody involved situation. Now you hope that Shane Bowen has a clear vision of how he wants to use them. And when that gets communicated, Isaiah Simmons takes that in, digests, and goes, okay, I need to execute 1, 2, and 3. And guess what? I still have another big contract in my future if I can figure this out. It may not be with the Giants, but that's a great opportunity to get the best out of a player if he feels like he's trying to put the good tape on right now for future potential suitors down the line in free agency.
At the end of the day,
Well, hold
Adam,
on now, Andrew. Don't get crazy here. You'll close this out in one moment. But first, I got to let you know that we have a void on this roster. The other thing that was brought up here by Shane Bowen was, hey, we got this player. Could it be that player? This is how we want to run this scheme. And then also, we need to figure out a way to give Dexter Lawrence some relief so that he can be as effective as possible on the interior. And there were no names mentioned in this very small snippet of this. And it'll be very interesting to watch in training camp. But that remains a key factor in all of this. Dexter Lawrence is one of the best at the positions. And it still feels like the Giants are trying to figure out, how do we make it? It's around him in the other positions as well, but how do we put a player next to him at times, or how do we give relief to him for a handful of reps without losing quality when he's off the field? That's, I think, a big concern for Shane Bowen and the Giants, saying we can't just take Dexter off and go, well, someone will sort that out. It's going to create a big problem. He's critical to this defensive success. They need to find a way to supplement and support him.
We talk about Jordan Riley being that guy. Hopefully he can get some more reps. We thought there was a chance that he could have a larger role last season. It didn't really materialize. Probably after that, I suspect that after Shane Bowen had said that, that's when the Giants went out and signed undrafted free agent Casey Rogers. That's when they worked out and then signed Elijah Chapman. They're just looking for guys in the rotation.
Have Jordan Phillips, the veteran in the room too.
Jordan Phillips is another guy that's in there. They're really looking for someone to be able to say, can we give Dexter Lawrence just a rest, maybe a couple snaps a game, so he doesn't have to be out there all the time. So the Giants are still searching for that. It's funny because during the draft process, it's almost like, oh, we know we have Dexter Lawrence, so we're okay. But then you realize if he ever gets injured or he needs to be off the field, there's no veteran on the roster where you feel totally confident that they could take over and give you 80% of what Dexter Lawrence has. And so it's a good call out by you, and it's a good call out by Shane Bowen to say, yeah, Dexter is an all-pro type player, but when he's not on the field, we still need to be formidable. And how do we do that? Right. It's going to be by committee at this point until we see what happens in training camp.
And that's why, at the end of the day, it's going to be interesting to watch this team, watch for cuts around the league, and see the way they make some tweaks to this roster. And I think what we'll learn through Hard Knocks is that there are these spots, as we know on paper, the Giants want to improve. They want to make these little moderate gains that allow a team that maybe is really good in some starting units, but could lose games in the margins because they don't have that supplemental depth behind them. I, for one, in that very small snippet that they provided at the Giants Legend Night, cannot wait for July and for this to start happening, because we've watched Hard Knocks over the years, the in-season stuff, but we don't see this. We don't see this for the New York Football Giants. In the Joe Shane era, they've been a little bit more putting out some things behind the scenes stuff from the organization. This is going to be an absolutely fascinating watch. And of course, we're going to be covering it all off season here on OGP. Go ahead, Andy.
No, I was just going to say exactly what you said. What I saw from the Giant Legends Night and the little bit that we got from Hard Knocks makes me want so much more. And I just keep looking to July 2nd when they announce it. And they usually have the sprinklers go off and you see the grass with the sun, but that's usually for training camp. I wonder if you're going to the preview is going to be in the war room, trade the pick, or how they're actually going to kick it off, because they're not on grass, right? It's do you have Joe Shane coming out of the car on the concrete? I'm curious to see how they kick this thing off.
It's all the music that you expect from Hard Knocks, intense, but then it's Joe Shane tightening the tie, fixing the collar, shuffling the papers, and then saying, hey, could someone get me a coffee from the cafeteria? Let's draft. Yeah, it's going to be different, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So as I said, we'll be doing that all this off season when it kicks off in July, talking about every single episode. I mean, I really am excited to get into probably the minutia of it. So be sure to follow us over on YouTube at One Giant Podcast. Obviously, get us on your podcast feeds. We remind you, we greatly, greatly appreciate if you go over to the podcast feeds, wherever you get it, subscribe. It is a massive needle mover, and we're trying to build that side of what we're doing. It means the world to us. So please, please do that if you can. Go and check out our sponsors as well. And until the next time, until the best times, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.